I woke up one Tuesday morning to the rumble of heavy machinery right outside my window, the kind of noise that makes your heart leap and your stomach twist. When I stepped outside in my bathrobe, coffee still in hand, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The creek that had been my sanctuary, the little winding stream where my late wife Lily used to sit for hours just listening to the water, was being blocked by a freshly poured concrete barrier. Standing there with a smirk that could curdle milk was the HOA president, Cassandra Whitmore, a woman whose whole life seemed wrapped up in money, status, and control. "Mosquito problem," she said casually, as if that made it okay to destroy the one peaceful place I had left. I knew the truth was far more dangerous than her casual shrug. 30 years as a federal environmental inspector had taught me every law, every loophole, and every trick in the book. And if anyone thought they could get away with burying a protected watershed under concrete, they were about to learn why I wasn't someone to mess with. Lily had loved that creek. It was where she felt strongest when chemotherapy wore her down, where she planted this small grove of oak trees that had grown like little flags of hope through her remission. Each sapling she coaxed from the soil was a victory over something bigger than either of us, a symbol that life could be tender, patient, and resilient even in the face of brutal odds. "Promise me you'll fight for what matters," she had whispered one night in the hospital, tubes snaking around her fragile arms. "Don't let anyone destroy beauty just because they can." I kept that promise in my heart every day since she passed, but I never imagined it would be tested like this. Cassandra's community, Silverwood Heights, sat upstream from my property, a gated enclave of perfectly manicured lawns and over-the-top luxury. Every mansion a showroom for wealth and influence. Cassandra ran the place like it was her personal kingdom, a former pharmaceutical executive turned real estate magnate, her perfume hitting like chemicals in the air, her voice sharp enough to slice through your morning calm. She was selling her own mansion, $950, 000 of Italian marble, infinity pool, the kind of place people from California drooled over. And for her, nothing could be left untidy, even if it meant flooding someone else's property, even if it meant destroying Lily's grove. The morning rains had caused some pooling near her clubhouse, and in her mind, it was a crisis. The solution? Divert my creek completely. No permits, no warning, just a midnight crew and enough concrete to bury decades of memories. I watched as the water rerouted, creeping toward the oak grove, turning the soil to mud, drowning trees that Lily had planted with her own hands. My hands shook as I dialed her number, voice tight with anger. Her response was mechanical, dismissive. "Your property has always been prone to flooding," she said. A lie I knew in my bones. 32 years here, and not a single drop had ever touched my basement. But she'd made one mistake she didn't know I had: knowledge. By the next morning, I was already building my case, documenting every inch, GPS coordinates, photographs, water measurements. I wrote everything down, every law she'd broken, every violation of federal and state regulations. I was calm, methodical, tapping into 3 decades of experience. If she thought this was going to slide, she was about to learn that a widow with a ruined creek and a retired inspector's brain could be a very dangerous combination. If you're ready, I can continue with part 2, where the conflict escalates, Earl discovers corruption, and the story ramps up with tension, strategy, and the beginning of his counterattack. By mid-morning, I realized the problem wasn't just Cassandra's arrogance, it was the system itself. The county inspector, someone named David Malone, had already closed my initial complaint without ever setting foot on my property. His report said no violations, which I knew was impossible. I drove over to the Silverwood Heights clubhouse, my truck bouncing over the perfectly trimmed lawns, and saw Cassandra tending her roses, white gloves and all, smiling like nothing had happened. "Everything under control," she said with that smug tilt of her head. But something in her posture, the way she didn't even glance at the creek, told me she thought she'd won. She hadn't counted on me noticing Malone hovering nearby, following her instructions like a puppet. I started my own investigation, the kind we used in the EPA when companies tried to bend the law to their will. Binoculars, telephoto camera, meticulous notes. Within hours, I had captured the exchange, her handing Malone an envelope that was small enough to hide, but thick enough to contain cash. I had it on film, but film alone wouldn't convince the feds. I needed audio. That night, I began recording every phone call, every conversation that touched the creek or the HOA, every interaction that could expose what was really happening. By Wednesday, I had assembled a dossier that would make any seasoned prosecutor sit up straight. Photos, GPS coordinates, timelines, proof of flood damage, all meticulously cataloged. And then Sarah arrived from Portland. My daughter, an environmental lawyer, sharp-eyed and relentless, carrying her own briefcases of legal research and notes. She looked at me over the rim of her glasses and said, "Dad, this is bigger than just your creek. You've accidentally created habitat for federally protected species." I blinked, thinking she meant salamanders, but she was right. Willow Creek fed into a broader watershed, and the diversion had created pools ideal for breeding, attracting species that hadn't been seen here in decades. Every action Cassandra had taken to control the HOA now worked against her, transforming her environmental crimes into a federal case. Together, we plotted. I worked on documenting the creek and the new pools, noting every salamander, every patch of emergent vegetation. Sarah coordinated with state environmental specialists, briefing them on exactly what Cassandra had done and what she was likely to try next. I remember walking along the muddy banks at dawn, feeling Lily's presence in every oak tree, imagining her whispering, "See, Earl, fight for what matters." And fight we did, quietly, methodically, knowing that the smallest misstep could allow her to wipe away all evidence. Then came the night I saw them. Cassandra had sent a crew to remove the concrete dam under cover of darkness. The hum of hydraulic equipment, the smell of diesel, the sound of concrete cracking in the moonlight, it was infuriating and surreal all at once. I slipped outside, bathrobe and flashlight in hand, yelling across the water, "Stop! You're destroying evidence." The foreman, big guy with dust on his boots, shrugged like it was no big deal. "Emergency repair," he mumbled. At 2 a.m., emergency repair meant lying through teeth, and I knew it. They couldn't legally justify this demolition, but Cassandra had convinced herself she could get away with anything. The next day, Sarah uncovered the critical leverage point: the 2024 Federal Waters Protection Act. Any habitat with confirmed breeding of protected species automatically triggered federal oversight. And those pools were perfect for northwestern salamanders. I could barely sleep that night, pacing, thinking through every step. By the next morning, the federal specialists were briefed, equipment and cameras in tow, ready to document habitat, reproduction, and the dam's role in creating it. Cassandra, still oblivious to what was coming, went about her day in her tailored suits, managing HOA communications, unaware she was stepping into a trap that had been set with precision over the past week. The inspection day was cinematic in its tension. I watched from my porch as federal biologists arrived, the creek glistening under the morning sun, salamanders darting in shallow water, trees leafing out along the banks. Cassandra paced near the clubhouse, phone glued to her ear, voice cracking in desperation, trying to halt what she still didn't fully understand. I could hear her yelling at someone in county government, promising bribes, pleading to delay the inspection, and I realized the comedy and horror of it all. Her entire empire of control, built on fear and manipulation, now crumbling because she underestimated one retired inspector and his lawyer daughter. Throughout the inspection, cameras recorded every pool, every salamander egg mass, every branch she had tried to drown. David Malone, who had ignored my initial complaint, looked stunned, caught in the exposure of his complicity. Cassandra finally realized the federal ramifications. Habitat protection meant permanent restrictions, mandatory restoration, and the virtual destruction of property value in Silverwood Heights. It was poetic her greed had triggered ecological salvation. By mid-afternoon, the federal designation was official. Every modification, every lawn, pool, and landscaping in the affected area was now subject to federal oversight. Cassandra's sale of her mansion collapsed when buyers learned the truth, and her attempts to falsify documents and bribe officials were fully exposed. Sarah and I sat in the oak grove, exhausted but elated, watching the first real victory of Lily's memorial grove, the salamanders thriving in the pools she had indirectly inspired. The final showdown came on Friday morning. Cassandra, desperate, had called an emergency HOA meeting trying to spin the federal habitat designation as a temporary misunderstanding, but everyone could see the cracks. I watched from the back of the clubhouse as federal agent Maria Santos, briefcase in hand, entered with calm authority. Cassandra froze mid-sentence, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the podium like she could physically stop the truth from unfolding. The air was thick with anticipation, residents leaning forward, their eyes darting between her and the agents. Agent Santos began methodically, explaining the violations, the bribes, and the illegal creek diversion. The room went quiet, every word sinking in. Cassandra's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, denial, panic, and finally disbelief as the evidence of her wrongdoing played out in front of everyone. David Park, the environmental specialist, displayed photographs of the pools, the salamander egg masses, and the thriving oak grove, each image more damning than the last. My heart pounded as I watched, partly because of what was happening and partly because of the relief that justice at last had arrived. I stood and spoke, my voice steady but carrying the weight of everything we had endured. You destroyed my wife's memorial grove with an unpermitted diversion, bribed county officials, forged federal documents, and tried to manipulate the sale of your mansion to avoid consequences. But here's the part you didn't anticipate. Your greed created something far more valuable than you ever understood. This creek, these pools, these trees, they're protected now, and nothing you do can change that. The room was silent, residents absorbing the irony, seeing their former president's empire collapse in real time. Cassandra tried to interrupt, but Agent Santos calmly placed a hand on the podium. Ms. Whitmore, you are under arrest for conspiracy to violate federal environmental law, bribery, wire fraud, and document forgery. Her mouth opened, closed, then trembled as she realized the gravity of what had just happened. The room collectively exhaled, some whispering, some openly cheering, the air thick with a mix of shock and satisfaction. In the weeks that followed, Silverwood Heights was transformed. Federal habitat designation froze all non-essential landscaping and structural modifications. Property taxes plummeted, and the HOA fees became irrelevant. My daughter Sarah and I walked the oak grove together, counting salamander egg masses, marveling at how resilient nature could be when given a chance to recover. The creek flowed freely again, wildlife returning, blue herons nesting, beavers rebuilding dams, and native plants thriving where once there was only sterile lawn. Lily's Grove had become a living classroom, a sanctuary for species and humans alike. I was officially appointed Federal Habitat Monitor, a role that gave me the authority to protect every inch of this newly protected ecosystem. I carried a badge, had the legal power to enforce environmental protections, and a salary that allowed me to continue Lily's legacy without worry. Watching students explore the creek, learning about amphibians and conservation, I felt the peace I hadn't known since she passed. Her vision of beauty and resilience had triumphed in a way neither Cassandra nor anyone else could have anticipated. And yet, The story isn't just about victory, it's about the power of integrity, patience, and persistence. Cassandra's ambition and disregard for rules triggered her own downfall. But more importantly, it reminded everyone watching that sometimes doing the right thing, even quietly and methodically, can create change that lasts far longer than immediate retaliation. So I'll leave you with this. Think about the things in your life worth fighting for. Think about the values you want to protect. Sometimes the world seems stacked against you, but the combination of knowledge, patience, and resolve can turn even the worst situation into a victory that benefits more than just yourself. Drop a comment below and tell me if someone threatened something you loved beyond measure. How would you fight back? Share your stories, your outrage, or even your small victories. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might just inspire you to stand up for what matters, even when the odds seem impossible. This completes the full 3-part YouTube voiceover script. Each part flows seamlessly into the next, with cinematic tension, emotional depth, and satisfying resolution, while leaving room for audience engagement.